frost, not a blanket, but 1,000 tiny feathers, settling with silent insistence on the warped oak shutters of the house on Steinhauser Gas. Inside Nordlingen's walls, winter gnawed at the stones, seeping through every crack. Within this half-timbered cage, the air hung thick and close, a suffocating blend of sour tallow smoke, the sharp temps of unwashed bodies, and the damp, woolen reek of cloaks hung too near the meager hearth. It was the smell of trapped lives, of breath held too long. Light, feeble and flickering, clung to the candles, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to flinch from the corners. In the dimness near the kitchen alcove, a figure moved with the quiet desperation of a cornered animal. Els, her fingers, reddened and chapped from lying in cold water, trembled, not just from the chill, but from a secret held beneath the coarse weave of her apron. A subtle, terrifying curve. Her hand brushed against it, a fleeting, protective gesture instantly crushed by dread. Els von Estet. K-name whispered once in a Swabian village, now buried beneath layers of grime and debt in this place. History would not remember her face, only the transaction she represented. The weight in her belly felt like a stone dragging her towards an abyss she could not name, only fear. A shadow fell across her, not the comforting gloom of evening, but the sharp, angular silhouette of Barbara, the keeper. Her eyes, hard as river pebbles, scanned Els, missing nothing. The slight stiffness in her posture, the pallor beneath the grime, the way her hand had jerked away from her stomach. Barbara didn't ask. She knew. A grimace, more like a crack in weathered stone, twisted her lips. Wordlessly, she turned, her heavy skirts rustling like dry leaves. When she returned, it was with a chipped earthenware mug. Steam curled from it, carrying a scent, both bitter and green, sharp enough to sting the nostrils. Tansy. A forgetting of endings forced too soon. Barbara thrust it into Els's unresisting hands. The heat seared her palms, a counterpoint to the ice spreading through her veins. The single word, devoid of inflection, hung in the air like a sentence. Around the dying embers of the hearth, the other women sat or stood in frozen tableau. Their eyes, reflecting the hearth's dull glow, held no surprise, only a weary resignation that spoke of horrors witnessed too often. Some looked away, steadying the smoke-blackened rafters or the patterns in the filthy rushes underfoot. One, younger than Els, bit her chapped lip, a flicker of shared terror in her gaze before she too lowered her eyes. They knew the purpose of the bitter steam, the silent command. They knew the price of defiance, the crushing weight of the debt ledger Barbara guarded like scripture. Their silence was a wall, thick and impenetrable, built from their own survival. It offered no comfort, only the stark truth of their shared captivity. The only sound was the crackle of the dying fire in Els's shallow, panicked breaths. The bitter brew scalded her throat, a physical echo of the poison coiling in her gut, in her soul. Later, much later, in the fetid back room, where soiled rushes clung to the packed of the floor and the smell of stale bodies was overlaid with something metallic and primal, the true agony began. Curled like a wounded creature on a thin pallet, Els buried her face in a strip of hardened leather, a saddle strap repurposed for muffling screams. Her body became a battleground. Wave after wave of tearing, grinding pain ripped through her, a violence as intimate as it was brutal. Life, tiny and fragile, fought its involuntary severance. Her screams, choked against the leather, were swallowed by the room's thick darkness, by the indifference of the walls. Sweat plastered her hair to her forehead, tears mingling with its salty tracks through the grime. Time lost meaning. There was only the red tide of pain and a desperate animal need for it to end, and end it did. In a final, wrenching spasm of agony and emptiness, Silence descended, heavier than before, broken only by Elsa's ragged sobs and the frantic hammering of her own heart. On a rough wooden bench beside the pallet, wrapped hastily in a scrap of stained linen, lay the small, still form, a son of 20 weeks, perfectly formed fingers, impossibly tiny. A life extinguished before it could draw its first free breath. The bundle looked like nothing so much as discarded laundry. Barbara entered, her expression unchanging. She surveyed the scene with the detached efficiency of a butcher assessing offal. No word of pity, no flicker of shared humanity. She merely bent, scooped the linen-wrapped burden off the bench with one hand, as one might handle spoiled meat, destined for the midden heap. She didn't look at Els, lying broken and bleeding in the rushes. "Clean yourself," she stated flatly, already turning away. The door shut behind her, sealing Els in with the scent of blood and loss in a crushing, echoing silence. The debt, Barbara's silent ledger would note, remained. It had merely grown heavier, compounded now by this invisible, unspeakable loss. Tombstone settling over her future. Days bled into each other, a gray smear of pain and exhaustion. Physical bleeding hadn't stopped. Dull, persistent ache throbbed low in her belly, a constant reminder. Yet the ledger demanded its due. The debt was a living thing, growing, feeding on her misery. Barbara's eyes, cold and assessing, left no room for recovery. The work resumed, scrubbing, carrying, serving the clients who filled the main room with their raucous laughter and stale beer breath. Moved like a ghost, her face pale as the frost outside, her movements stiff with unhealed wounds, both seen and unseen. The other women avoided her gaze now, not out of shared terror, but from a superstitious fear, as if her tragedy were a contagion. Then the sound, the groan of the heavy oak door swinging inward on its iron hinges. A blast of frigid air sliced through the smoky warmth, carrying the scent of snow and horses. Boots, thick-soled and mud-caked, thudded heavily on the worn threshold. A soldier, his face ruddy from cold and ale, its cloak dusted with melting snowflakes that glittered briefly like fallen stars before vanishing into the damp wool. He stamped his feet, shaking off the chill, his eyes already scanning the dim room with a blunt, hungry appraisal. He saw the available women, the promise of warmth, the price listed in Barbara's sharp voice. He did not see the slight tremor in the kitchen maid's hands as she clutched a bucket. He did not see the unnatural pallor beneath the candlelight. He certainly did not see the dark, telltale stain, fresh and ominous, slowly seeping through the coarse weave of her skirt, a silent testament to the life violently taken, the wound brutally reopened. His arrival was merely the next transaction, the next turn of the screw in the relentless machine of the house. The frost on his cloak melted into nothingness just as the small life had vanished. Outside, the wind moaned around the shutters, carrying the faint, distant clang of the town bell, a sound that spoke of order, of time passing, of a world utterly indifferent to the silent scream still echoing within these walls, and to the crimson truth slowly spreading beneath a soldier's oblivious gaze. The cold here was not just in the air, it was in the marrow, in the soul, a chilling prelude to the deeper shadows yet to be explored in the city's hidden veins. The clangor of bells, not the clear single note of a country church, but a dissonant chorus rolling off the domes and campaniles of Venice, drowning in the evening mist rising thick from the canals. It was the sound of vespers, of piety proclaimed. Across the city, built on shifting water and unspoken bargains, along the Rialto, where gold changed hands as swiftly as the tide. Swaying lanterns cast long, trembling fingers of light onto the slick paving stones. Their glow illuminated a heavy oak door, marked not by a sign, but by a subtle weariness in the wood, a collective sigh absorbed into the grain. Casa del Toleranza, the House of Tolerance. A municipal lie dressed in stone. Inside, the air hung thick, a humid fog of cheap wine, damp wool, and the underlying, ever-present brine of the lagoon. Tallow candles guttered in wall sconces, their smoky breath clinging to velvet drapes grown threadbare with use and neglect. A Florentine merchant, his fingers still stained with ink from contracts signed that day, reached out, not for a ledger, but for the small, cold bells sewn onto the rim of a woman's felt hat. He jingled one, a sharp, tinny sound that cut through the low murmur of the room. Lena flinched, almost imperceptibly, the forced smile tightening on her lips like a drawn wire. The hat wasn't hers by choice. It was the city's decree, the council's mark. Let all know her, lest an honest woman be confused. A walking scar, jingling with every step. For protection, the sleek, fur-clad counselors had declared, smoothing their consciences like silk. For order. Protection felt like the frayed edge of her sleeve, threatening to unravel completely. Order was the ledger on the keeper's desk, thick with entries written in a cramped, merciless hand. She offered him wine in a chipped boccale, the rough ceramic cool against her fingertips. Welcome, Messer. The words tasted like ash. His gaze slid over her, past her, landing on the hat again. A flicker of disdain mixed with crude interest. St. Augustine's ghost seemed to whisper from the damp, hot plaster walls. Offer meretrices, de rebus, huminis, turbiveris, omnia, libi denubis, remove the prostitutes from human affairs, and you will pollute everything with lust. A convenient sewer, sanctioned by God and counsel both, to keep the palazzos smelling sweet. Yet the lie curdled in the humid air. When the merchant, displeased by the sour wine, or perhaps simply by the weight of his own unacknowledged desires, struck her across the face, the sound was a sharp crack against a stone wall. Lena stumbled, the ceramic cup shattering on the floor, red wine spreading like a wound on the tiles. No magistrate stirred, no guard intervened. The keeper, a thin man with eyes like stagnant puddles, didn't look up from his ledger. His quill scratched on, noting the broken cup, the spilled wine, another line added to Lena's unpayable debt. Protection was the echo of the blow ringing in her ears. Order was the indifference that followed it. Dawn crept into Venice, not with glory, but with a gray, suffocating light filtering through high, barred windows. The bells had fallen silent, leaving a hollow, quiet, broken only by the distant cries of gulls and the slap of water against the fondamenta. In a cramped, windowless alcove, barely large enough for the copper tub, Lena knelt. The water was tepid, already clouding with the grime she scrubbed from her skin. She used a rough cloth and harsh lye soap that stung the fresh bruise blooming on her cheekbone. Her movements were frantic, almost violent, scraping at flesh as if she could peel away the night. The touch, the shame etched into her by the bell-adorned hat. The water turned a sickly gray, swirling with the residue of countless transactions. Through the small, high opening, she watched. Below, on the canal, a sleek sandalo glided past. Within it sat a woman wrapped in fine wool, her face pale and serene beneath a modest fat swallow, gloved hands clasping a velvet-bound prayer book. Lena stopped scrubbing. She remembered those gloves, She remembered the scent of incense clinging to her own mother's sleeves after Mass, the feel of cool stone. Under her knees in the family chapel, before the ships sank, before the creditors came knocking, their voices as hard as the Florentine merchant's fist. Before her father, broken and silent, had led her to this door marked by weary wood and municipal sanction. The water in the tub was now utterly opaque, a murky mirror reflecting nothing but loss. She rose, water sluicing off her, leaving her shivering in the damp chill. Reaching for a small pouch tucked beside the tub, Her fingers closed around dried rosemary. She crushed the brittle needles fiercely between her palms, releasing a sudden, piercing aroma, sharp, clean, alive. It was the scent of the hills above Vicenza, of sun-warmed earth and wind rustling through silver-green groves. It was the scent of a life full ledgers and bells in the sour tang of the casa. She pressed her palms to her face, hailing deeply, desperately, as if she could breathe the memory into her lungs and hold it there, shield against the gray dawn in the weight of the hat waiting on its peg. But the scent faded quickly, overpowered by the lingering damp, the stale wine, the ever-present salt. Tita, it was a ghost, as fleeting as the childhood it recalled. Forests she would never walk in again. Freedom as distant and unreachable as the mountains themselves. Outside, the city was fully waking. The rhythmic thump of laundry beaters echoed from a nearby square where boat builders worked. Down the canal to Lavandai, their arms, strong and red from the cold water, laughed as they hauled sodden linens onto the fondamenta. Their chatter, bright and ordinary, floated up to Lena's window. They worked hard, their lives edged with labor, but their heads were bare. No bells marked their passage. Their laughter wasn't forced. They moved through the morning light towards the market, towards homes, towards lives woven into the fabric of the city, not cast into its designated sewer. The sound of a child's bright, carefree laughter suddenly rang out from a passing gondola, sharp as the broken bell on her hat. Lena flinched, her hands dropping from her face, shooed down at her own reddened skin, the bruise darkening. The water in the tub, now still and utterly dead. The rosemary's ghost was gone. Only the scent of the casa remained, damp wool, despair, and the crushing weight of a shame not hers alone, but borne under the indifferent gaze of saints and senators. The laughter faded down the canal, leaving only the rhythmic slap of water in the heavy silence of the room, a silence broken only by the keeper's voice, already calling from below, summoning her to tally the night's accounts, to prepare for the evening's tide of need. The bells would ring again at dusk, the careful, complicit order of Venice, built on the silent drowning of women like Lena, would flow on, as relentless as the tide beneath the Rialto, whispering promises of filth contained while the true corruption festered in the light. The last echoes of Venetian bells dissolved into the salt wine, replaced by a different music, the relentless drumming of rain on Southwark's crooked rooftops, the gurgle of overflowing gutters, the sucking squelch of mud under countless boots. Gropecant Lane, the name itself, shouted by carters, muttered by housewives, carved crudely on a tavern sign, was a brand as indelible as the one Agnes now wore. Rain slicked the uneven cobbles, turning the narrow thoroughfare into a treacherous, glistening mirror reflecting the leaning, jetty buildings above their timbers, black with age and damp. It pooled in the ruts left by cartwheels, reflecting the sullen gray sky like shards of dirty lead. Agnes huddled deeper into the meager shelter offered by a protruding shop front, the sign of a chandler swinging wildly above her head. The coarse, ray cloth of her striped hood, mandated by law, scratched against her cheek. So honest women need not fear confusion, the aldermen had decreed, their voices dry and distant in warm council chambers. The hood wasn't shelter. It was a cage woven from wool and judgment, a walking scar visible through the downpour. Winchester goose, the bishop's branded property, leased out, traded, taxed. The name tasted like bile. It reduced her breath, her heartbeat, her silent terrors, to a commodity stamped with ecclesiastical approval. Her fingers, numb with cold, delved into the small leather pouch tied beneath her skirts. She counted the coins again, her touch hesitant, fearful. 3 pennies, 3 thin discs of silver, cold against her skin. The arithmetic of survival was brutal. The keeper's cut, hefty, for the privilege of the bishop's protection. in the rented room that smelled perpetually of damp plaster and mice. The rent, extortionate, for 4 walls near the stews, and the midwife's fee. Annis's hand instinctively pressed against her lower belly, a phantom ache echoing the last miscarriage. The midwife, her eyes hard and practical, had taken the coins without a word, leaving Agnes alone with the cramps and the hollow emptiness. 3 pennies. Barely enough for stale bread and a scrap of cheese. Not enough for firewood. Certainly not enough to chip away at the debt. The word was a cold stone in her gut, heavier than hunger. It wasn't just money owed for the room, for the thin blanket, for the watery ale. It was the keeper's ledger, a ledger inspired by men like Leonhard of Nordlingen, infamous for his inventive cruelties. Agnes remembered the keeper's thin lips listing the charges: a broken cup, a halfpenny deducted, wine spilled, deemed soured by a displeased client, another halfpenny, the very straw pallet where she lay with men, a penny per night, for where each transgression, real or invented, meticulously recorded, inflating the sum that bound her tighter than any chain. The debt was the keeper's whip, the bishop's silent sanction, the true meaning behind the striped hood. It was the cage door, locked from the inside by desperation. Her fingers, almost of their own volition, traced the ridge of flesh along her ribs, beneath the rough wool of her kirtle. A scar, long and thin, a cruel souvenir from a ship's captain, whose appetites ran towards violence, disguised as passion. Cade refused payment afterward, claiming dissatisfaction, his eyes gleaming with a predator's satisfaction as he'd drawn the knife. The keeper had shrugged. Choose your clients. Better, goose. The scar throbbed sometimes, a dull ache in wet weather, a permanent reminder of the body's vulnerability, its worth measured in pennies and pain. The rain intensified, drumming a frantic rhythm on the chandler's sign overhead, matching the frantic beat of her heart against the cage of ribs. A shout echoed down the lane, sharp and authoritative. The watch, regulation of streetwalkers. None shall walk beyond the lane's end after Compline Bell. Off the streets, goose, or it's the stocks. The voice was bored, routine. The law, another layer of control, another way to herd the branded cattle back into their pens. Compline Bell had faded hours ago into the wet gloom. Agnes knew the penalty, the stocks in the muddy square, the jeers, the rotten vegetables, the crushing weight of public humiliation layered onto the private shame. The keeper would add another fine to her debt for the inconvenience. The watchman's heavy boots splashed closer. Agnes didn't move towards the familiar, hateful door of the stew. Instead, she stepped out from the meager shelter, fully into the downpour. The icy water hit her face like a slap, instantly soaking through the striped hood, plastering the coarse wool to her skull, running in cold rivulets down her neck, under her collar. She turned her face upwards, letting the rain wash over her, closed eyelids, her parted lips. It tasted of the city's soot, rot, the distant Thames, too, but it was also, shockingly, brutally clean. Let them arrest her. The thought wasn't defiance, but exhaustion so deep it felt like surrender to a different force. Let the stocks hold her, let the mud suck at her feet, let the jeers fall. Could it be colder, more humiliating than the keeper's ledger, the client's hands, the bishop's silent, profitable sanction? The watchman's startled curse reached her as she walked, not towards the stocks, but away from the lane, towards the broader darkness where the city met the river. She reached the edge. The Thames sprawled before her, vast and powerful in the near darkness, its surface churned by the rain into 1,000 shifting peaks and troughs. The air here was thick with the smell of it, wet earth, decaying reeds, the metallic temps of sewage mingling with the powerful, ancient scent of moving water. The rain lashed down, merging with the river, indistinguishable. Agnes stood on the slippery bank, the mud pulling at her worn shoes. She reached up, her fingers numb, and slowly, deliberately pushed the sodden striped hood back from her head. It fell heavy on her shoulders, exposing her rain-slicked hair, her face to the elements, to the indifferent gaze of the night. The cold was a physical blow, stealing her breath, but it was also a strange, terrible relief, like shedding a suffocating skin. Moonlight, pale and fractured through the scudding clouds, caught the roiling surface of the Thames for a fleeting moment. It illuminated the floating detritus, broken barrels, nameless refuse, the undeniable evidence of the city's filth dumped into the ancient flow. But for that instant, the light also transformed the churning water into something almost beautiful, a vast, shifting plain of liquid silver. Agnes looked down at the dark water swirling near her feet, then out towards the distant, unseen sea. The cold seeped into her bones, a profound, shivering emptiness. The debt remained. The hood lay heavy on her shoulders. The scar ached. Yet here, in the roaring silence of the rain in the river, under the vast, indifferent sky, for a single, suspended moment, she was just Agnes, standing at the edge. The filth swirled beside her, but the moonlight offered no absolution, only a cold, silent question hanging in the saturated air. Downriver, blurred by rain and distance, the formidable silhouette of Westminster rose, its towers like dark teeth against the bruised sky, a silent testament to the powers that ordained her shame and profited from her body. The river flowed on, carrying secrets and sewage towards the sea, while the rain, relentless, washed the mud from the bishop's palace walls. Silence, not the absence of sound, but a thick, cloying quiet that pressed against the ears like damp wool. It filled the small chapel nestled within the shadow of Westminster, a place meant for whispers to God, now heavy with unspoken transactions. The only light came from a single beeswax candle, guttering before a crude wooden statue of the Virgin, its flames struggling against the pervasive gloom. The air smelled of cold stone, old incense, and the faint, lingering sourness of extinguished tallow from earlier mass. Kneeling on the unforgiving flagstones, her forehead pressed hard against the chill, Maud felt the rough stone bite into her skin, the striped hood of her trade, the mark of the Southwark stews, felt like a brand against her neck, even here in God's house. She was a smudge of color in the grayness, a walking sin seeking absolution she knew was priced beyond her reach. "Bless me, Father," she whispered, the words scraping her dry throat, "for I have sinned." The confession felt hollow, a ritual performed out of a desperate, fading hope rather than belief. Her body ached from the previous night, a client whose demands had crossed the thin line into violence, leaving her ribs tender, her spirit raw. The priest shifted behind the lattice of the confessional screen. Maud could see the blurred outline of his profile, the dark shape of his cassock. He didn't need to see her face clearly. The striped hood proclaimed her identity louder than any words. His gaze, she felt it, sliding past her kneeling form, past her whispered sins, towards the iron-bound offertory box fixed to the wall nearby. It gleamed dully in the candlelight, its slot a dark, hungry mouth. It was well fed, that box, fattened on the pennies wrung from the bodies of women like Maud, the bishop's tax on flesh, collected weekly by men who never set foot in the stews they profited from. Piety and profit, sharing the same cold bed. 10 Hail Marys, the priest murmured, his voice devoid of warmth, a tired recitation. He didn't ask for details of her sin. He didn't offer counsel. His attention was already drifting, perhaps to the next penitent, perhaps to the accounts that would tally the offertory's intake against the rents collected from the brothel keepers. Leasing the bishop's properties across the river, he began to turn away, the movement abrupt, dismissing her like a servant. St. Thomas Aquinas's cold justification seemed to hang in the incense-thick air. Sicut, si in pallatio toleres cloacas, catum palatium fodes. Just as if you removed the sewer from the palace, you would fill the whole palace with filth. Maud was the necessary cloaca, the sanctioned filth that kept a bishop's palace, his power, his order, smelling sweet, rising stiffly. A sharp pain lancing through her side, Maud limped out of the chapel into the weak afternoon light. Westminster's towers loomed above, symbols of divine and earthly authority carved in stone. Seeking the familiar squalor of Southwark felt like retreating into a known wound. She passed the bare garden, its timbered walls vibrating with a different kind of fervor. The roar of the crowd inside was a physical thing, a beast in itself, hungry, bloodthirsty. Pushing through the throng gathered outside, drawn by the noise, she caught a glimpse through the open gates. In the muddy pit, a chained bear, its fur matted and flanks heaving, bellowed in terror and rage as mastiffs, sleek and savage, tore at its throat. Crimson stained the brown fur, the brown earth. The crowd screamed, a wave of sound that crashed over Maud, making her flinch. The bear's agony was a spectacle, a sanctioned release of savagery. 8. Much like the violence inflicted on the bishop's branded women across the river. Profit was extracted from both arenas. Coins tossed for a glimpse of suffering, coins collected for access to bodies. Back in the cramped, damp room she rented near the river, the roar of the crowd faded, replaced by the dripping of water somewhere in the walls and the low throb of pain in her side. But a deeper, more insistent dread coiled within her. The familiar cramping, the telltale absence. Again, the violence wasn't just external. Ledger of her body demanded another payment. She had nothing left, no coins for the midwife, no strength for another silent ordeal witnessed only by indifferent walls, only the knowledge of the bitter herbs. From a small, hidden pouch, she took dried pennyroyal and rue. The sharp, pungent scent filled the tiny space as she crushed the brittle leaves between the smooth river stone and the room's single, scarred, wooden stool. Green mercy, bitter release. The motions were practiced, born of desperate necessity, passed between women in whispers. She sprinkled the green dust into a cracked cup, poured lukewarm water from a jug, stirring it into a murky, poisonous-looking tea. Steam curled upwards, carrying the acrid green smell, a scent that spoke of endings forced in shadow. Raising the cup to her lips, the bitterness hit her tongue first, sharp and unforgiving. She forced herself to drink, gagging slightly as the gritty liquid slid down her throat. Decay tasted like earth in decay, like the very essence of the life it sought to expel. As the bitterness filled her mouth, a memory flashed, vivid and unwelcome. The priest's hand earlier that day, not in blessing, but as he turned away from her confession, his fingers, long and pale, had brushed against the offertory box. A smear of deep, sacramental red wine stained his fingertip. It had been a fleeting touch, almost accidental, as he checked the lock. The image burned, the sacred wine, symbol of Christ's blood, mingling with the grime of coins extracted from suffering. The wine of redemption, the wine of hypocrisy. Maud swallowed the last dregs of the bitter tea. A different kind of heat began to spread from her belly, a low, insistent burn promising pain, promising emptiness. She set the cup down, the sound loud in the quiet room. The memory of the priest's wine-stained finger wouldn't fade. It merged with the taste of the pennyroyal, with the coppery tints of her own blood she knew would soon come, with the imagined scent of the bear's blood soaking into the mud of the pit. Hypocrisy, she realized with a chilling clarity that cut deeper than the coming cramps, wasn't just an idea preached from a pulpit. It was tangible. It had a texture, rough stone pressed against a sinner's brow. It had a scent, incense, overlaid with the sourness of extinguished tallow. And now she knew it had a taste that lingered on the tongue, sharp and unforgettable, metallic like blood. The silence in the room deepened, waiting for the herbs to do their work, while the distant echo of Westminster's bells told the hour, marking time in a world where sacrifice was demanded, but sanctuary was sold. Silence, but not the thick chapel quiet of Westminster. This was the fragile, suffocating silence of a secret held too tightly, trembling on the edge of sound. It clung to the cramped storage room tucked behind the kitchen of a Bruges brothel, near the canal where the water smelled perpetually of damp rot and fish guts. The air hung heavy and still, thick with the scent of moldering grain sacks. Dust motes dancing in a single slanting shaft of gray light, and something else, the sweet, milky scent of a newborn, layered over the sour tang of unwashed bodies and despair. Not a silence of peace, but a breath held of desperate hope confined by damped stone walls. Lisbeth crouched on the packed earth floor, back against a rough sack of rye, keys in the crook of her arm, wrapped in a scrap of linen thinner. Then Hope lay her son, 3 months old, a tiny face pale as new cheese, eyelids fluttering with the effort of each shallow breath. His small chest hitched with a wet, rattling cough that tore through Lisbeth like a knife. She pulled him closer, wrapping her threadbare shawl tighter round them both, trying to press her own warmth into his fragile body. The keeper's warning, delivered with a bored flick of his hand days ago, echoed in the silence. Silence the bread during customers' hours, or out he goes. Noise costs coin. The threat wasn't idle. It hung in the air, colder than the draft, seeping under the door. The room was a repository of neglect, broken stools, discarded pottery shards, sacks leaking their contents onto the dirt floor. Yet, within this squalor, a fragile raft had formed. A crust of hard, dark bread, still slightly warm, lay near Lisbeth's knee, slipped to her by Ank, whose own eyes held the hollow look of repeated losses. A small earthenware cup, miraculously intact, held a sip of watered ale, left by Greet. Their solidarity was wordless, passed in fleeting touches, shared glances, heavy with understanding. It was the only currency they had that wasn't measured in the keeper's ledger. Crust, a sip, a moment's respite, tiny acts of rebellion against the crushing machinery of the house. But the cough worsened, a deep, tearing sound that shook the tiny frame. Lisbeth's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive quiet. She leaned down, her lips brushing the fevered skin of the baby's forehead. It burned. Tears welled, blurring the small face. Desperation, a familiar taste, rose in her throat. She began to sing, her voice a thin, cracked whisper, barely louder than the baby's labored breaths. A lullaby her own Flemish mother had sung in a cottage, smelling of peat, smoke, and herbs. A world away from this moldering darkness. Slop, Kinge, SLAAP, ... bitten, looped, in, shop, ... double quotes, sleep. Outside walks a sheep. The melody, simple and ancient, seemed to hang suspended in the dusty air, a fragile spell woven against the encroaching dread. For a moment, the coughing subsided, the tiny body relaxing slightly against hers. Lisbeth closed her eyes, clinging to the song, to the ghost of her mother's voice, to the fleeting illusion of safety. Beyond the thin wooden door, the fragile silence shattered. A merchant's voice, thick with ale and impatience, boomed through the brothel's main room. Ale now, woman? Oh, do I take my coin elsewhere? Followed by the sharp thud of a fist pounding on a table. Lisbeth flinched, her song catching in her throat. The baby stirred, a whimper escaping his lips. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She held her breath, pressing him tighter, willing him to stillness, to silence. A tear escaped, tracing a path through the grime on her cheek, falling onto the baby's face, mingling with the sheen of his fever sweat. The fragile raft of solidarity felt miles away. She was alone again, adrift in the terror of the keeper's ultimatum. She knew the stories whispered in the dark, the brutal arithmetic applied to inconvenient life. Infants smothered under pillows, tiny bodies wrapped in rags and left in stinking alleys before dawn. Poppy tea dripped onto gums to enforce a permanent, deadly silence. The keeper's ledger had no column for a mother's grief, only the cost of disruption. Dawn approached, not with color, but with a gradual leaching of the darkness into a cold, gray half-light. The sounds from the main room had subsided into drunken snores and the low murmur of the women cleaning up. Lisbeth hadn't slept. She cradled the small bundle, now terrifyingly still. The fever raged, but the coughs had become weaker, farther apart. His breaths were shallow flutters against her neck. She knew the fragile flame was guttering. The silence in the storage room deepened, profound and final. Gently, she kissed the damp forehead. No tears came now, only a vast, hollow emptiness, moving. With a dreadful mechanical.com, Lisbeth gathered the small body. She wrapped him carefully, tenderly, in the cleanest scrap of linen she could find, a stolen kitchen cloth. Then, she slipped from the storage room, a shadow flitting past the slumped figures in the kitchen, past the keeper's closed door. The back door groaned on its hinges as she eased it open. The garden beyond was a small, neglected square, hemmed in by high walls, choked with weeds and the skeletal remains of last summer's growth. Frost rimed the dead stalks, glittering faintly in the pre-dawn gloom. The air was knife-sharp, smelling of earth and decay in the distant, metallic tumps of the canal. Her eyes scanned the frozen wilderness. There, a single, ancient rose bush, its thorny canes bare and twisted, clawing at the gray sky like gnarled fingers. Some stubborn instinct, a memory of beauty, of life persisting, drew her towards it. Kneeling on the frozen ground, the cold biting through her thin skirt, she began to dig. Her fingers, numb and raw, scraped at the hard earth, breaking through the frost crust. It was slow, painful work. The hole was shallow, pitifully so, barely deeper than the length of her forearm, but it was all her strength, all her time allowed. She placed the small, linen-wrapped bundle inside. For a moment, she rested her hand on it, feeling the terrible lightness, the finality. Then, slowly, she pushed the cold, dark earth back over him, covering the tiny shape. Her fingers smoothed the mound, patting it down with a tenderness that felt like the last gasp of her heart as she started to rise. A thorn from the ancient rose bush caught the rough wool of her sleeve. It snagged, pulling her back for a moment. She looked down. The thorn, sharp and black, had pierced the fabric, a small, painful anchor. It felt like a plea, like a final embrace from the indifferent earth. She carefully disentangled herself, leaving a tiny thread behind. The first week, rays of dawn were just touching the highest part of the brothel wall, a pale, watery light that did nothing to warm the garden. It only illuminated the small, raw mound of earth beneath the thorny rose canes in Lisbeth's empty hands, stained with dirt and frost. The scent of decaying vegetation and cold soil filled her nostrils. Inside, a door banged open. Voice, the keeper's, called out, sharp with morning irritation. Lisbeth stood, the cold locking her joints. She looked back once at the rose bush, the thorns like dark accusations against the lightning sky. The garden door groaned again as she slipped, back into the shadows of the house, leaving the tiny grave to the frost and the coming light. The keeper's voice demanded breakfast. The ledger awaited its daily tally. The city oblivious, began to stir, and beneath the gnarled rose, the smallest of secrets returned to the earth, a silent testament to love, measured in stolen moments, and a shallow grave. The story of the brothels was written not just in ledgers and laws, but in the unmarked earth of forgotten gardens, in the weight of a rusted key turning in a lock, sealing another woman, another secret inside.